I have no idea what to expect this season. And I don't mean that in the, ooh, I'm interested in what's going to happen next sort of way. I mean that on a, I honestly don't know how the hell they're going to tell 12 episodes worth of story with what has just happened in season 2 sort of way. The last season's climax felt definitive, final, climactic. Pick any assortment of words that indicate finality and that would be it. There was a coming full circle with both Reigen and Mob's character arcs respectively. Both have grown tremendously and found their footing in a good place at the very end of the series. If someone told me that was it at the end of season 2, that's all one wrote, I would have accepted it and called it a perfect series. But now I'm staring down the barrel of something I don't know what to anticipate from. Which on one hand is exciting, but on the other it makes me wonder, can one stick the encore after executing one of the best seasons of anime I have ever seen? Only one way to find out. Anxiety aside, going into this more than anything, I was overcome with curiosity. How was one and this team working at Studio Bones going to make this final season feel final? There has to exist some emotional through line that gets paid off, so let's see what episode 1 has to offer. These seasons normally start off with a few standalone episodes that act as the building blocks or indicating factors that point us to the general direction of how this season is going to conclude. So let's see what's cooking in these first 2 episodes. Something I noticed rather quickly was the tonal difference or contrast expressed between these opening episodes from season 3 and the opening episodes from season 1. In those season 1 opening episodes, the focus of the plot was to demonstrate how and where Mob was lacking in his life, and that just so happened to be pretty much everywhere, with the first episode itself ending on a note that lingered with a sense of longing for what he doesn't have: friends. Season 3, on the other hand, opens with a collection of episodes emphasizing just how that has changed, forcing us to reflect on the evolution of this character, and the most powerful aspect of this being, he transformed in ways that all of us have the power to transform ourselves. As I pointed out in the beginning of this review series within the first episode itself, Mob felt very much like a side character in his own show, with him not really showing up until many scenes and character introductions later, acting as the mop for Reigen's mess, with his introduction to us in the very first episode being from behind where he was barely noticeable in the background of his own show, with the scene itself specifically centered around him as he's surrounded by all of his friends he's made thanks to the brave choices he's stuck to. I love stuff like this, and the substance of the episode itself only further reflects why I love it. Career Path Survey. God, I remember those, and good God almighty, I did not know what to do. Ranked 190th, which is very middle of the road for that school apparently, Mob sits nicely, and doesn't really know what he wants to do, but all he does know is that he wants to pursue his crush. We get exposed to pretty much every other adjacent character's overall academic ranking. The Body Improvement Club all looks like how you'd expect. They've put all of their time into their bodies, and their academic goals are either nothing or are helped by the extracurricular achievements in sports and athletics. Except for one. I love how one of them is randomly ranked second in the entire school or year, I'm not sure, and looking to become a vet. That's just kind of funny. But all that aside, I do relate to this episode quite a lot. I remember distinctly at the age of 17 sitting in my guidance counselor's office completely stressed out of my mind when she confronted me about not filling in my forms for college yet. Truth is, at 17 and well, even at 25, I still didn't know what it was that I wanted to do with my life. This is all to say that not knowing what to put down for one of these future forms in school is stressful and at worst depressing and terrifying. As I praised at the end of episode 13 of season 2, I was thrilled that Serizawa and Mob both found a place in Reigen's business that helped them feel like something worthwhile. And the way this episode builds and leans into this new dynamic was brilliant. They encounter a man professing that he has been cursed by a spirit that has made his life unsuccessful. He attributes all of his personal, social, and professional failings to this spirit. And while Mob and Serizawa exercise this spirit successfully, both are left reeling after this encounter as they can both see themselves in the mistakes this man has made. This man is in his 50s, Serizawa is 30, and Mob is still in school, but looking at this man offers them a mirror or future projection to how their lives might be if they don't make the right decisions from here on in. And this is where Mob demonstrates profound levels of growth as a character once again, and really this aspect of his character is where the focus focus is placed in these opening episodes. While the first few episodes of season 1 demonstrated fairly basic areas of Mob's life where he was severely lacking, these episodes offer far more understandably complicated and difficult social situations and professional circumstances where many people might find difficulty, but Mob somehow finds a way out of it thanks to his mindset, the most interesting of which episode 1 concludes with. And this conclusion Mob reaches concerns comfort, and one's choices dictated by that. The idea that comfort isn't necessarily a goal one should seek, but rather the enemy of personal development and progress is a wonderfully mature and profound way of looking at things for someone as young as he is. And because of this, Mob has to make decisions he otherwise isn't comfortable with because they are what's best for him. That he must eventually step away from Reigen and his company, with his reason being the only thing that would change about him if he were to stay there would be his age. And the best part is, there's no hard feelings, and Reigen supports Mob's decision.
とにかくやりたいことなんて別に仕事じゃなくたっていいし、お前はお前の好きなように生きればいいんだ。
Somewhat confusingly, the episode ends with Dimple sitting atop a giant piece of broccoli that was in the arc prior. This doesn't make any sense in context, but we'll no doubt in a few episodes or so. Episode 2, in the same fashion as episode 1, acts as a standalone episode that serves to emphasize the growth of Mob again. More specifically, his ability to speak up for himself, his ability to lead and prioritize problems that he has despite it being inconvenient to others. He's able to put himself first, which is great for everyone to learn. The episode itself sees Mob accept the job of a costume or prop designer for a school day of sorts, all the while Reigen humors the silly antics of some self-professed yokai hunter? Okay. Naturally, this doesn't interest Reigen until a massive amount of money becomes involved, to which Reigen begins speaking in a theatrical fashion just like the yokai hunter. It's hilarious and fun, specifically when the yokais eventually do show up. However, there is one thing that's a little weird about this place. There's like these weird roots and vines growing everywhere. I don't know, whatever, I'm sure it's nothing. They take out the Yokai King easily, and in the process of doing so, Mob solved his own problems without the help of Reigen, which is again another wonderful little development. In the end, the work Mob and his team did for his school wasn't exactly praised, but it felt rewarding because they liked it and they knew they had worked hard to make it. Now, before I dive into the minutiae of the next 4 episodes, which make for themselves a very compelling and well thought out mini-arc, I'd like to discuss a rather large change that's taken place on the production side of things for this season 3 specifically. During my breakdown of the production for the prior 2 seasons of the series, Tachikawa was the series director in addition to being super hands-on throughout those seasons. Unfortunately, during the production of this final season, he was busy directing an anime called Blue Giant, and so a new series director was brought in called Takehiro Hasui. Hasui's been with Studio Bones since 2012 and directed the 6th episode of Mob Psycho in season 2, so he's not a complete outsider by any means, but this is the first time he's ever led a TV series. Interestingly, however, while Tachikawa was working on another project, he did remain somewhat working on the series in a more hands-off supervisory role. Though, outside of offering a small bit of storyboarding in episode 10, his main contribution was taking on a scripting role writing episodes 7 and 8 of this final season, which isn't too strange seeing as he also wrote episodes 6 and 7 in season 2. Now, I thought this was worth mentioning right off the bat because it's not often you see directors of adapted works writing scripts. Moving on from those broad strokes, however, the first episode is both boarded and directed by Hasui himself, so it's nice to get a sense right away of how suitable he is for this role. The answer is very. Mob Psycho 100 is such a special series to these people because it's all about elevating its source material, taking fun ideas from one's manga and extrapolating cool new set pieces from them. Right in the first half of this episode, Reigen fixing something with rice is turned into an hilariously dramatic action move in the anime. It's a simple change, but one that lets me breathe a sigh of relief over the demonstration that this still feels very much like Mob through and through. Within the first episode also, we have returning character animator Toshiyuki Sato animating a very Kameda-esque sequence of Reigen along with Koke Fujimoto of Chainsaw Man fame, who produced this fantastic scene that feels like a nice parallel to a similar season 1 sequence. And it's certainly not the only reference in this episode either. Concerning episode 2, however, Hasui storyboards once again, and we get to see his skills as an action storyboarder this time around, and I was very curious to see the results of this. And these results are pretty damn competent, tying together characters and the environment in ways we've come to expect from this series. You can see this throughout in these stunning stunning sequences that showcase awesome background animation, which, as I mentioned during my breakdowns of previous seasons, is but one of the many common elements of Mob's animation in its series that does not make use of CGI. Overall, the second episode for me was one that definitely solidifies Hasui as a great successor to Tachikawa. However, as I'm sure you'll notice as I talk about what else this season has to offer, what's probably the most fascinating aspect about this season is that it completely breaks the mold of a typical anime production. As I mentioned in the previous videos, Mob Psycho's production always had a strong production environment, often finishing its production before the final episode airs, but Season 3 was different. This time, the entire season was completed before even the first episode hit the air. This is almost unheard of. Now, with that said, however, this season isn't as action-driven as the prior two, nor is it quite as ambitious due to many of its former animator associates being busy elsewhere, but a conservative season by Mob Psycho 100 standards is still light years ahead of most other shows, and despite this talent pool change, there are plenty of returning stars to continue to shine. Mio Sato returns once again with her incredible paint-on-glass animation throughout the season, and she even takes on the ending sequence herself, something she also wowed us with back in Season 1. I have so much more to say about this production, but I'll leave it here for now. Time to move on to the next and first mini-arc of this final season. The Divine Tree. Right off the bat, I just want to say that this mini-arc is my favorite part of Mob Psycho thus far. I liked it better than the climax to both the previous arcs, and I shall intend on explaining why in this preceding section, but in short, it's a rather straightforward story with nuances and interesting areas for the involved characters, taking them in directions we've not yet seen before in this series to date, all told within the context of broccoli zombies. You heard me right, broccoli zombies. This is the best arc of all time. There's a really cute but short scene that kicks off this episode, and indeed this mini-arc to a large extent, where Mob actually has a positive interaction with Tsubomi without embarrassing himself and indeed impressing Tsubomi by coming to her social rescue. The point of this successful interaction once again is to act as a contrast to the horrible interactions he's had in the past, all the while shining a light on the blossoming social life he now has with a number of girls in his school, with that reality suddenly paving the way for a very different set of circumstances to befall Mob, that being, he's popular. How can you blame him? But the tearful pride, relief, and happiness Ritsu has for his older brother speaks for itself. He knows how he struggles socially, and to see that no longer be the case must be a massively uplifting sight for him. It's such a wonderfully tender moment, but it isn't without certain drawbacks. Hilariously on-the-nose visual metaphors aside, Mob does get a big head over this concerning his newfound popularity. And this could not come at a worse time because it's also the time the cult surrounding Mob has mobilized around the giant broccoli to worship it. And moments later, Dimple shows up and says to Mob, his popularity has gone to his head, and confronts him about the founder of the new religion audition, and Dimple, true to fashion, tries to weasel his way into the conversation, but Mob sees through it, and maybe his ego allows him to believe he doesn't need Dimple's help at all. Mob's confidence is turning into overconfidence, and that's when Mob confronts Dimple with a pointed question.
横取りしようとしてるのはエクボも同じでしょ。他の連中っていう人たちと何が違うの？もう悪巧みやめたら。
Two failed arranged meetings with Mob and female friends later, and one bad t-shirt purchase, we find that despite Mob having decided to go onto the podium to audition for the position of founder, since Misato bailed on him, Mob didn't go. But curiously, someone looking just like Mob arrives at the podium to wow the audience. This is where the plot of this mini-arc starts to ramp up and things really start to become mysterious. As Reigen watches from the comfort of his own home on livestream, this supposed founder sprouting before everyone in the audience a giant broccoli stalk. The next day yields a lot of suspicious activity. Both Misato and Tomo, who they were both meant to meet Mob the day prior, now are suddenly all in with this new religion, but in addition to that, have no memory of why they bailed on the respective arranged meetings with Mob in the first place. But once Reigen shows Mob the clip online, mixed with the strange goings-on in the town, being slowly infested with these mysterious roots, not to mention those weird new broccoli green candies people are giving out for free everywhere, the true nature of what's actually happening starts to form a clearer image. They need to destroy that broccoli, and Mob agrees. In the midst of all this craziness, Teru has his own little adventure with the brainwashing broccoli plant. The section itself is really well directed, and there's a heavy emphasis on the smaller details in the day-to-day that I really enjoyed. The openings of fridges, the slow rise of someone's head to look up, or even the use of a mundane vending machine. All these subtle details that are given extra attention really help to ground the episode, no pun intended, but more broadly, this section really more than anything else just serves to expose us to the real enemy of this section and what we can come to expect from him and his goals. Vomiting up the food that he had just been brainwashed with, Teru investigates the giant plant in an effort to put an end to all of this craziness, but through doing so, gets sucked into a terrifying fight against this broccoli mob figure. The fight between the two is rather great, but once again, this section really serves primarily to expose us to the necessary details of this character that we're encountering right now, to show us what this being's strengths and powers truly are, while cutting away to other characters like Minagishi, who grabs the roots draining the city and falls to the floor unconscious as a result. And as the fight continues with Teru, it's finally revealed that all of this has been Dimple all along. Dimple is the founder, the spirit who formulated all of this. He says that mob doesn't matter, that he's always had one goal, and that will be to become a modern god. Ooh, the plot suddenly just became so much more interesting. A foundational character now playing a key role in an adversarial position. And cut away to Mob and Reigen formulating a plan. They think that they might need help with this, and so see if Ritsu will help. When in actuality, he's actually brainwashed and just guides them to more followers in the hopes that they accept this new religion too. Needless to say, Mob and Reigen just run away. And as of right now, it's really starting to feel like the entire city is pursuing them, like there's no one left in their right mind. And feeding into this very notion is a brilliant piece of character writing between Mob and Reigen when Reigen catches Mob calling the founder fake. Now, this is a very important thing for him to call him out on. Reigen says that that's a very strange thing to say, seeing as the group didn't have a founder in the first place. And this is so subtle, and while it does go on to be revealed that Reigen is also brainwashed by the wacky plan too, it's also evident that something far more subtle is at the root of all of this. Mob's ego. The same ego that pushed Dimple away to perform this mess, but needless to say, Mob doesn't accept anything Reigen says, of course, and tearfully runs away to set this whole situation straight. With heroic music booming in the background, he begins to step towards the divine tree. He's going to save everyone, and visually, this is communicated by him stepping out of the shadows, no longer hiding, and asking for free entry to the person who so feverishly in the past begged him to do just that. People rejoice that they now have two founders. Tsubomi and all the gym bros watch on. This tree and Dimple have infected the minds of the entire city. This is where things really start to get mindfucky, and this fanfare Mob is experiencing, this clapping and cheering, it's all from Dimple. And strangely, it contrasts harshly against what he said the episode prior, that he doesn't need Mob anymore. Well, if he's trying to feed into Mob's ego here to manipulate him, why is he doing so if he doesn't need him? He shows him Teru restrained and claims that Ritsu and Reigen are under his influence too, with the explosion counter in Mob rising. He even draws attention to what he made Reigen say, that in the end, the ones who have the most fun win.
それをレーゲン師匠に言わせたのもお前だったのか、エクボ。
Dimple tries to convince Mob to join him, explaining that everyone in the city and everyone he ever knew is under his control now. I think it's safe to say that Dimple within this series is one of the few characters who can claim that they know who Mob really is and how he thinks, what his weaknesses are, and what he can do to exploit just that. And he does so through uncertainty. And it's quite unsettling. He forces Teru to fight Mob, trying to confuse Mob by leveraging the lesson he tried to tell Teru back in season 1, not to use his powers for his own self-interest, and all of this makes even me as an audience member feel unsure and unsettled as a result, but Mob, he sticks to his convictions, because he isn't the same kid that was in season 1. Exploding with power, sending Teru flying, more of these broccoli monsters start to show up and subdue Mob as his explosion meter rises. Dimple, still refusing to show himself despite being called upon by Mob, refusing to face him. Is he scared? Well, Mob falls to the floor after clutching his chest. His powers being sucked away. Dimple is now all-powerful, deciding at this moment now to appear before Mob. But interestingly, despite fighting him, the vast majority of his time is spent still trying to convince him over to his way of thinking.
これがこの度めでたく申請した神エクボ様だ。
Just a quick aside for a second, the animation for this transformation, and indeed this form, reminds me so much of Frieza's transformation into Golden Frieza. Everything from the form itself to even the reveal animation. The swooping grand angles feel very Frieza, but also really help to sell what Dimple is doing here. Dimple is combining everything he knows about Mob to defeat him, draining him of the max energy he demonstrated during the fight against Toichiro Suzuki, alongside the mind games he learned from Mogami, through the lens of someone Mob thought of as a friend no less. This is an interestingly evil decision by Dimple, and an approach that me sitting right here now watching has me thinking, damn, this just might actually work. On both of these occasions, Mob came close to losing, to dying, and combining these approaches with a close friend's underhanded attack, it's more likely to succeed than pretty much any other approach that's been taken in the series. However, in response to this, Mob takes a different approach again.
見合わない、許さない、認めない。
Dimple explodes with a massive attack and regrets firing it with such energy almost immediately by catching himself, but he says that he can still feel his rage. Mob once more asks for Dimple to say something honest, something authentic, but he doesn't and attacks one last time.
シャツが出せ!
I think given the fact that Mob has been the point of view character in this mini arc, with him effectively trying to figure out the mystery surrounding Dimple with his ever dwindling number of allies, it's then an interesting choice to not have Mob himself be the POV character of the climax, but instead to switch it over to Dimple once he reveals himself. We're shown his internal thoughts, his strategies, and his concern as Mob creeps closer and closer to 100%, and once he does explode, nothing happens, because we're still stuck only seeing the thoughts of Dimple. We're made to empathize with him that little bit more. We're confused just like him. What is happening? And the monologue from Dimple is quite telling. He's confused, but not once prattles on about his plans for world domination. He's not looking past Mob even in the slightest. In fact, he seems more concerned about whether or not he, Mob, has given up on him, that he's resigned to giving up, to turning this fight into a half-assed climax. And I think that, more than anything else in this arc, feels like a cry for help. Like he wants Mob to convince him. And as Dimple threatens Mob's life one last time with a sharp blade inches from his face, Mob says he won't do it. By turning off his powers, Mob lays himself defenseless, and by doing so, exposes Dimple in return, both metaphorically and literally pushing through his guard.
やっぱりエクボは信頼できる。
The lesson here harkens back to a number of instances in this story, reflected in the words Reigen offered him in passing about those who gain confidence usually going too far before finding their footing later. And as Mob admits, rightfully, he didn't treat Dimple with the level of respect and care he needed to when he was at his most vulnerable. Through this, Mob realizes the role he played, all the while seeing that the exact same shortcoming and lesson befell Dimple. They were two people going through the same thing, and by being such, fed into one another, creating this mess we see before us. By hearing him out and offering him what he's always truly needed, Dimple is allowed to, on his own terms, realize for himself that he has more in common with Mob than he might have ever even realized. That just like him, all he has ever really wanted wasn't to be a god or to be a leader or to be some cult of personality, but to be acknowledged, to be seen, to have a real friend that wants him for who he is and nothing more. And it makes sense that manipulation is Dimple's calling card in this instance. He doesn't trust anyone to actually want to altruistically be his friend. And in giving Dimple that time of day, Mob saved everyone in the town and indeed Dimple from himself. It's a brilliant story, reaching a conclusion with Dimple carrying a defenseless and sleeping Mob back to his bed to rest.
目的も失ったし、どうすっかな。
And suddenly,
おい。
This is such a cool idea, made possible with this world and its unique mechanics, but what in reality is happening here is that Dimple now has to face the consequences of his actions alone, without the help of his support system, to do what makes him uncomfortable, to do something dangerous for someone else, to do the right thing. The Psycho Helmet wants Mob for sustenance, but Dimple refuses his advances. Here we have a fight between the real Dimple and the part of him that he rejected, his good side versus his evil tendencies, and Oh, I was so excited watching this. The way this broccoli doppelganger moves is even spooky in and of itself. Like he's some sort of evil spirit or specter, impervious to the attacks of the real world. And in this moment, Dimple is the only one standing in defense of an unconscious mob while staring down hundreds of clones. The fight itself is spectacular and comes with its own bells and whistles we've come to expect from this incredible series, with Dimple slowly having the energy drained by his impressive foe. But even outside of that, there's such an incredible sense of scale to this fight. The occasion is grand and the action surrounding it, my god, it's stunning. And then, the final scene takes place, where from the midst of this intense action, we cut to Dimple waking up Mob. He's unable to stand, but for the first time proper, Dimple is able to use his powers to manipulate Mob for his own good. And despite the goals he's espoused to have in the past, he chooses to let Mob walk out under his own power. It's through this brief interaction that Dimple acknowledges just how strong Mob is, and as the seconds tick by, we notice a scratch on his cheek and more damage as time passes on. And as the camera pans out slowly but surely, we recognize the damage that Dimple himself has taken, and moreover, that he's used this power to lure Mob home because he knows he may never see him ever again. From such a heartfelt and uplifting finish to their encounter, one has dragged us back to the pits of despair and sorrow as he reminds us of what happens when we get too carried away, when we hurt too many people, that those consequences just might exact the ultimate toll. It's a crushingly beautiful, selfless, heroic, and sad scene, but one I am delighted Dimple got to have. And as Mob sits there, lying in his bed, unsure of what exactly happened, his heart knows the truth, and he cries himself to sleep. This is the first major action episode of the season and was directed by Yuta Kiso. Having previously worked as an animator on shows like My Hero Academia as a regular animator, episode 6 is his very first time directing an episode proper, and interestingly, he's actually a newcomer to Mob Psycho 100 series, having only contributed a small, rather unrecognizable section of season 2's opening. Transitioning from an animator to a director/storyboard artist can be rough, but his work here is truly remarkable. Not only does it nail the action sequences with the most monumental scale possible, it also manages to execute the emotional moments with real gravitas. The animation staff assembled for this episode is pure all-star material also, and the results speak for themselves. I mean, this does not stop moving. Yoshimichi Kameda takes on the animation director role, and along with him there's the legendary Yutaka Nakamura, Yuki Hayashi, Hironori Tanaka, and many other all-star names. It really is just the most ludicrous episode. Nakamura's sequence is undeniably the highlight, however, of the episode, with his trademark three-dimensionality and dynamic lighting that just explodes off the screen. The scale here, I have to reiterate, is off the charts. Tanaka's smoke is also insane, and the snappy timing feels very Kameda-esque in its execution, helping these sequences blend together nicely. Many people know Yuki Hayashi for his Dragon Ball Super Broly work and his many contributions to My Hero Academia, and he's here too, pulling off the same craziness with arguably the most weighty scene in the episode. There's a quality to this work that's hard to put into words. It never loses its sense of exaggeration, despite how much grounded oomph it conveys. The big emotional finale with wonderful lip sync, however, hasn't had its animator identified yet, but it's one of those scenes that jumps into realism in a way that really grabs your eyes and emphasizes the emotional weight of the scene. The Telepathy Club arc. These are the episodes that convinced me that this story could focus on just about any of the supporting cast and still deliver superb storytelling that captures my attention and imagination perfectly. I love these characters, and on this particular occasion, it's graduation time. Entrance exams for some private schools will start soon, and unlike the last mini-arc, which focused largely on Mob himself, this one more specifically focuses on the insecurities of Tomei and the wider Telepathy Club as they struggle to face a difficult reality, that they may just have wasted all their times goofing off instead of working on themselves or building memories in this club, taking it seriously. This is a very interesting idea and direction to build on the story. We've seen Mob focus on the Body Improvement Club for these very reasons, and in this moment we see the rest of the club sort of come to grips with that lesson, with the very growing pains of this realization acting as the impetus for this entire mini-arc.
脳幹電波部はこれにて解散。まあまあ楽しかったわ。
This is the indirect call to action for the rest of the club to try and help Tome not feel as though she's a total failure, to help her once and for all make real strides towards her goal that she created this club for, to meet aliens. Now, naturally something like that would seem completely unreasonable in any other sort of story, but let's not forget that this is Mob Psycho 100's world. We're talking about a story where the main character can hurl buildings while crying and a magical giant head of broccoli can brainwash thousands. And so naturally, Inukawa, one of the other boys from the Telepathy Club, employs the help of Mob, who employs the help of Ritsu, who eventually employs the help of those two,
Yeah, come on, you can do it. I believe in you.
What were their names?
Hmm.
Oh, the twins, Daichi and Kaito. Who could forget them? Anyway, jokes aside, while the stakes are comparatively low compared to those that occupied much of Season 2, the fact that this contends more personally with the characters we've all come to know and have grown attached to, it actually feels all the more important as a result of that. I was so damn invested in how they were going to resolve some of these seemingly unsolvable problems. How would they attract the attention of a real telepath and not a crappy one like these guys? Well, as it happens, they can send a signal to attract other telepaths, and Mob can boost that signal, which creates one of the coolest twists and creative choices of the entire season.
誰だ？うわ、びっくりした。お前らなんでここにいんの？
Takanaka, the guy who left the club in episode 2 of season friggin' 1, answers the call. I cannot describe to you how damn cool this choice was creatively. Not only is it a callback that sent me reeling, but his showing up and initial departure are all linked to the underlying themes and journey of this story. The reason he left in the first place was because they clearly weren't serious like he was about understanding telepathy and the club itself. But as soon as they start to show that level of seriousness and compassion, they created for themselves the perfect set of circumstances to bring him specifically back into the fold. This is terrific storytelling and character writing 101, and even some advanced shit. It is awesome. And the icing of the cake is Mob breaks through his wall too, finding common ground with him coming from a place of isolation also. And guess what? Takanaka, because he's a telepath, knows that Mob isn't lying to him. I love stuff like that, and this was by far the best scene of the episode.
すいません師匠、遅くなりました。
気にするな。今日は大晦日だし、ゆっくり行こうぜ。
This scene is hilarious, and if you know, you know. I ain't explaining why. The plan, however, is to drive to a mountain, go to the top of it, and give Toma her telepathy experience, with Reigen agreeing to tag along and drive, with the ultimate goal being to use Takanaka to make contact with aliens using Mob as a signal booster. As they make their way up the mountain, enjoying setbacks both mentally and geographically, I just have to point out that the direction of this episode is absurdly stunning and on another level compared to pretty much every other episode I've seen up until now. And you best believe I'll be talking about exactly this in the production section for this episode in just a moment, but regarding the narrative, there's a moment with Takanaka that once again highlights that one knows exactly where to put the focus in his stories, and that place is the heart and emotion of a particular scene. And really, more than anything else, that's the calling card of this particular artist. It's why, despite the crude drawings at times, millions of people read his work. More than just this incredible direction I praised earlier, it's the heartfelt and tender message that this episode offers. Takanaka cared so much about this and Toma's experience that he dedicated his entire night to learning and researching everything he needed to for today, explaining away his lateness earlier in the episode, which was a brilliant touch. It's just such a touching revelation, with the very ritual that takes place itself acting as a wonderful prelude for all of us to take a lesson from. That venturing outside of our comfort zone and putting in effort with friends to achieve and try something is not only fun, but can change our lives, create memories, and more importantly, can change your outlook on life. However, shockingly, they do make contact with aliens. I love how Tome is so nervous that she reaches out to shake their hand with the wrong hand to do so with. It's such a subtle detail, but for me really went a long way in visually communicating how nervous and really important this moment was for her. Needless to say, they have a great time hanging out with the aliens and playing games like they did in their homeroom. Almost like all that time wasn't wasted after all. And yet, despite all that's going on, Reigen's mind is on the passage of time. The new year, late fees on his rental. He looks at this group of kids and says that they are, quote, blinding, almost like their future is all ahead of them and looks promising. And I'm of course just inferring this, but when you take into account his relationship with his mom, what she's been writing to him, and what little he's shared about his past, it all seems to point in the direction, perhaps also alluding to him not feeling fulfilled in his life. I mean, he's very much the proverbial extra wheel in this group of children, while having himself no plans for New Year's. Anyway, with that said, they all exchange gifts with the aliens before leaving, except Inukawa, who accidentally stays and gets abducted. More on that in just a second. Tomei is thrilled with her experience and says it's a new year she will never forget. This was a really nice, serious, oddly introspective, and emotionally mature mini-arc centered around a group that represented exactly the opposite of that in the series. And really, that's perfect, because this episode is for people that feel like that. The end of school life as we know it is a formative period for anyone, and to see this story leverage that common aspect of all of our lives to help tell this captivating and heartwarming tale is just so powerful. Production. The one, the only, Hakuyo Go returns to completely blow minds once again, in a distinct flavor unlike anything we've yet seen from him, and it is breathtaking. Go's head-turning episodes have previously been huge action climaxes, and yet this is an episode with no such fighting or action, and one that proves, more importantly, that Go's versatility knows no limits as an artist. And I'm referring to him as an artist and not simply as an animator here, because, much like his episode on Season 2, this is all from a single mind. He takes on the role of direction, storyboarding, and animation direction, meaning everything you see in this episode is Go through and through. His animation direction here is incredibly striking, doing away with model sheet adherence in favor of blobby, loose characters with almost no shading and very distinctive rounded hair, displaying a constant striking approach that extends throughout the episode entirely and is truly emblematic of how Mob's production environment is creator first. Its artistic freedom has been a defining part of its success, and it really is on full display here. It truly cannot be overstated also, however, just how animated this episode is and feels. When talking about other episodes, I've definitely said, this does not stop moving, which is a bit of hyperbole to emphasize the insanity that is the quality of the animation across the episodes. But that statement applies with no hyperbole whatsoever right here. It genuinely does not stop with its ludicrous character animation for its entire runtime. It is one of the most insane feats I've ever seen committed to an episode of its type, and the painful thing is, I'm sure a lot of people typically wouldn't notice this because it isn't an action episode. There's such a grounded approach to the animation that, believe it or not, it is not rotoscoped in any way also. You have foreign animators like Julian Bentley producing insane work of characters simply walking. There's crazily detailed shots that have no reason to be as good as they are, such as Reigen taking his shirt off. Like, that is insane, and it's a background element. It just goes on and on. Walk cycles from super hard angles, fully fleshed out cities and crowd shots. It is breathtaking through and through. And on the topic of talking about crazy animation Sakuga, this episode also has what is as close as you can get to music Sakuga, if that makes any sense at all. Starting at 1646, the entire back third of the episode is one contiguous, dedicated piece of music. Not something that you see literally anywhere else in general, let alone Kawaii's Mob Psycho 100 score. And honestly, this creative choice has me perplexed. Maybe one could argue that it gives this entire section of the episode a rather alien feel to it. Not that it sounds alien, but that it feels alien to have this one big piece of music over an entire third of an episode unbroken. I mean, that big track does transition from largely earthly textures like strings and woodwinds to more alien-sounding instruments like synth patches once we do get to the final scene detailing Inukawa's adventures in outer space. And then, as if the episode itself wasn't enough of a flex, it throws in a crazy alien jungle sequence animated to perfection by Yuki Hayashi once again and Ajin. And on the topic of this closing section, it reminds me, Tachikawa scripted this episode and features some major changes to the manga. In manga, many chapters famously end with omake stories that are not present in the anime generally speaking. But interestingly, in the manga, some of these actually expand on character backgrounds that are not present in the anime, like the Awoken Kids, for example, which got that added bit of attention in the manga. But for these particular omakes, at the end of the Telepathy Club story, Tachikawa used them to produce the strangest and yet greatest sequence in the series, Inukawa's abduction. The manga section of this plays out as a regular gag manga, ending abruptly at the moment where they come back to Earth and realize that they can't find Inukawa. That's the punchline, that's the joke, that's the end of it. Then, during the next few chapters of the mob conclusion story, we're presented with the omake known as Inukawa's Diary, every chapter representing a different time and experience from those abduction days, narrated by Inukawa himself via a journal he's writing, and it's the same journal we saw in the anime. But the anime, on the other hand, takes all those omake pages and makes this weird, crazy, somewhat unsettling and hilarious story about Inukawa's misadventures in this alien world. It's an outstanding change to the source material in my book, and one that totally enhances the material. The final arc, episodes 9, 10, 11, and 12.
Say the line!
Mark.
This is the best arc of Mob Psycho 100 by default. And I say as much because it utilizes literally every element and every event that made the Mob Psycho 100 story what it is today. This is a storytelling triumph, and more than that, an utter masterpiece, masterstroke, and masterful work of art. As everything from the production to the narrative setup and set pieces and even the music work together with a unified vision of bringing to life what is, in my estimation, one of, if not the best arc of storytelling I've seen from an anime in my life. This is a special story, one near and dear to my heart now, and I hope that while I break down why I think this is so impressive, you find something that you too can take away from it. So let's dive in. One of the many aspects that makes this arc so successful in my opinion is how it leverages a character's point of view to tell a compelling story. Changing the point of view of whose or narrative POV can be interesting, but changing POVs can also give us a clearer picture of the reality at hand, divorced from the feelings of a particular onlooker. Now that's a lot of words. What do I mean? Well, for now, let's take a look at the focus of this episode and indeed a big role player in this final arc, Tsubomi. This arc is effectively about Mob mustering the courage to ask out Tsubomi before she transfers to a different school. And in the opening moments of this arc, we see a dream Mob is having about her and him playing as children. It's nice, it's warm, and it's fantastical. However, when we contrast that with the actual core memories he has of her while he's awake, you have for yourself a very different outlook on the scene and indeed her as a person, creating this sense that while she and he were once close, nowadays that doesn't seem to be the case. This is reinforced musically around the 9-minute mark of episode 9, where we hear the music that was used for the alien investigation now repurposed for the discussion between Mob and Misato concerning Tsubomi, someone who is now foreign to both of these folks talking in the scene. But what's more is that in this scene, and indeed later episodes again, they begin to show a very understated visual design aspect of Tsubomi that I could well imagine went unnoticed by many people watching this video. And it's unique to the anime. In the manga, Tsubomi is depicted with largely the same style all the other girls have. Plain, mostly regular sized eyes, crude eyelashes, etc. But in the anime, she is the only female character with traditionally anime characteristics. Huge sparkly anime eyes, more traditional anime eye shapes, thick top eyelashes, you know the stuff. However, in this episode, around the 9-minute mark again, a keen eye begins to notice that how Tsubomi looks in the anime is probably actually largely up to Mob's interpretation or fantasy of her through his point of view. And so when we see Tsubomi from Misato's point of view in this scene, 9 minutes into the 9th episode, we see her depicted less flatteringly, with the bottom eyelashes and smaller, more traditional eyes. Later in the finale too, we see this even more explicitly in this sequence of images. This little detail, which is also a bit of a retroactive explanation for her played up anime design, is brilliant in my opinion. And on the narrative front, the entire episode itself is basically comprised of Mob asking the advice of the litany of characters that have made up this series for advice on how he can approach asking Tsubomi out. And honestly, Reigen's advice is the best piece he receives, saying that while he should keep all the advice he's received in mind, he shouldn't worry about strategy or keeping up appearances. That if Tsubomi is the sort of girl Mob wants a deep relationship with, she'll like him and be with him for who he is. And interestingly, once Mob leaves, he shares a rather illuminating piece of dialogue concerning his view of himself. He says, "If this were me, I'd probably just try to be slick. I mean, if they found out who I really was, I'd get rejected in an instant. This was a line that confirmed for me that my suspicions concerning Reigen's self-esteem were well-founded. Near the end of this episode, Mob decides to set up a meeting with Tsubomi via a phone call, and I cannot imagine I was the only one who with their heart in their stomach while watching this, hoping and praying that he doesn't mess up too badly, and I think this is emphasized because for the entire call there's virtually no music, just ambient noise from Mob's house. There's an unusually heavy emphasis on folly here. Sounds of doors opening, bags rustling, footsteps are all elevated higher in the mix than they would usually be. A great call in my opinion, as it really heightens the tension of the scene. I think many of us have been there on phone calls with significant others or crushes when we were younger. The feeling is not unfamiliar. The silence of almost everything but the words and the sounds around them capture this sense of tension we all know too well. Which brings us to the fateful day where Mob makes his way to the park to meet Tsubomi and ask her out. Everyone he's met and continues to meet seems to make this process the best it can be. All the advice, support, and even flowers he's given are all provided by people that he has helped in the past. Surely this encounter will be the same. This is the part of the story where we realize that Mob has one more demon to exercise. One more emotional hurdle to overcome, and when I say that this is one of the best depictions of struggling to accept who you are as a person, I mean that. What unfolds from this point on is utterly and dumbfoundingly incredible on a narrative, animation, and even a musical level. No punches are pulled here, and just like the rest of the series, the entire crew and production behind this entire series is firing on all cylinders. This is the final time we are introduced to the character indicated by 3 question marks. Mob has overcome a host of difficult adversaries across this series, some stronger than others and many which pushed him in complicated existential and sometimes physical methods, the likes of which he only barely made it out of those situations alive. Characters like the members of Claw, Mogami, Toichiro to name only but a few, but today, Mob faces the individual he's been the most fearful of throughout this series. The foe that is the indirect source of Mob's internal traumas and indeed the main antagonist of this entire series, himself. And who can stop him? As an adaptation, the reference of question mark after Mob gets hit by a car is handled quite differently in the manga than it is in the anime. Once again, it becomes a question of direction and point of view here, in other words, what we as an audience member are allowed to see and understand. The biggest difference the manga offers here is that we actually get to see much more of Mob than we do in the anime. In the anime, there's no dialogue for him, and instead we don't see him standing up and destroying everything that gets in his way. Instead, we see the destruction wrought on the city from far away, through the eyes of civilians, the news, and other characters from the show. Personally, I really like this approach as it offers this sense that someone else is behind the wheel, someone we don't know. And by keeping this distance, the directors indirectly position us as viewers to see this as the act of a mindless monster, causing destruction around him out of pure instinct. In other words, we get the distinct impression that this isn't the Kageyama Shigeo that we all know and love. The manga, however, takes a very different approach, and honestly, there's merit to this direction too. There's this ominous feeling from him when he wakes up. He talks for the very first time, and what he says tells us right away that this is in fact not Kageyama Shigeo. This is the moment of confirmation, and in the anime, this is presented much later during an inner monologue between the two of them. When you already know the identity of the power, that he is part of our Mob, a part that he kept hidden from everybody, you realize that Shigeo and Mob might as well be 2 separate identities at odds in his mind. And this was when you might think that those 3 question mark symbols on his percentage name could instead represent 3 missing letters. M-O-B. Personally, I prefer the approach taken in the anime. It positions us as fans to receive the swerve later on in a much more effective fashion, in my opinion, and moreover feeds into this narrative direction the story will be taking from this point on. That Mob is in trouble, and whoever this is needs to be stopped. I think from a structural standpoint, the most impressive aspect narratively, or one of them at least, is that of who is chosen to stand in the way of the rogue Mob and why. And to those that didn't catch it, this might be a pretty neat little observation I've made. As I mentioned, for the longest time, Mob has been terrified of this exact situation occurring. A traumatic concern born from a lifetime of feeling like he has no control past a certain point. A breaking point we've been shown a number of times throughout this story. What instances during this story did he break? Who did he break in front of? Teru, Koyama, Toichiro, Ritsu. All of the people who, in that order, stand in his way one after the other in this very arc. Those that once acted as the reason to draw this entity out of him are now standing on the other side of the field looking to do the exact opposite, to help Mob, to save him, to put this genie back into the bottle. And through these individual clashes, what's highlighted isn't how adept they are necessarily, or how strong they have become, or even how they lose, but instead how different they are to the last time they faced each other morally, ethically, and personally. It's a frankly perfect narrative choice in my opinion. Teru versus Mob. If I'm being honest, of the upcoming fights I mentioned, this is the one that received most of the attention from an animation standpoint. On the visual front, there are a lot of comparisons made to the first fight. Instead of fighting for ego, Teru is fighting for the right reasons. Instead of putting other innocent people in danger, he saves them directly and defends them with his dying breaths. He even gets his clothes melted away again, this time not because he's obstinate or big-headed, but because he's courageously standing in front of a hurricane of psychic energy, hoping that if he can just hold on, he can make a difference. He can save Mob. Despite the blood leaving his eyes, his shield shattering, or his skin burning, he wants to save Mob. He wants to save everyone. Ultimately, he doesn't succeed, but he does succeed in showing how much of a radical change his character has undergone in the last 3 seasons, and he saves an enormous amount of people in the process. Koyama versus Mob. Of the 4 encounters Mob squares off against, this is the least impactful and striking in my opinion. In fact, most of it is shown off camera. However, something worth discussing is that Koyama now has made something of himself that is honest. No longer working as the muscle for a criminal syndicate, now he manages and operates out of a small shop. And instead of trying to antagonize someone, in this situation he's very much on the defensive. But perhaps most miraculously, despite there being a tremendous amount of damage being done, despite sirens blaring, and despite evacuation notices being issued, Tsubomi is actually waiting in the park for Mob. Despite being surrounded by all the chaos, she still waits. Now, that is either stupid or immensely honorable. I'm willing to give her the latter, but they aren't necessarily mutually exclusive either, I suppose. Toichiro versus Mob. Toichiro's battle or confrontation with Mob, while getting a substantial amount of flair via some great animation also, has a brilliantly appropriate and resonant conclusion. One that I think we need to see more of in these kinds of series. Toichiro's goal here is to try and save Mob the same way he did for him. He tries to use his power to absorb Mob's energy and closes the gap, making it a war of attrition, but even then, Mob is so savagely powerful. More powerful than he could ever hope to be. And even with the added support of his son Sho, they still aren't anywhere near strong enough to put an end to this here and now. This is where Toichiro knows he has only one option left to take Mob down and to put an end to this. And in identifying this option, he shows just how much he's changed since the end of that 2nd season.
Sho, 肩を貸してくれないか。逃げよう。
A lesser anime would have just indulged in a simple and rather vapid sacrifice, but this is an incredibly mature and moving decision, one that honestly has stayed with me longer than that vapid sacrifice could ever have been, deciding instead to flee with his son, valuing what he has a second shot at, cherishing henceforth. Ritsu versus Mob. More than anything else, this moment really serves to provide us with exposition for Mob's psyche, exposition for the very first time Mob lost it. In other words, the inciting incident that led to this entire story and Mob being the way that he is. Someone who hates who he is deep down. Ritsu says that he used to be scared of this form, thinking that it was a different version of Mob altogether. But now I think he understands that he was wrong, that it's the same older brother that he's always loved, that it's a part of him. And the reason he's so destructive is due to Mob himself not being accepting of that part of him. And it turns out that those times that Ritsu went to Mob and asked if he wanted to talk about things, that they all came from that very day, and Mob's sudden shift in character. He wanted power so that he could be ready for this moment, to be here for his brother, but despite his best efforts, he can't stop Mob. It's from this moment on, Mob continues to walk and we suddenly become privy to a conversation or conflict taking place in his mind, where there's a terrific visual metaphor for exactly what is taking place. It's here we realize that that side of Mob, that part that's being locked away, it isn't necessarily bad, just suppressed beneath years of trauma. And now, it's exploding, ready to take control and to never give it back again. And it's at this point in time, I think we realize that only one person can stop Mob. Despite being the final part of this final arc, I wanted to separate this episode from the rest because I think it's just that important. Not just in the context of the story with it providing everything I wanted and more, but also because this is a conclusion that teaches a very valuable lesson everyone, I think, at one point or another in their lives needs to learn. My grandparents never learned this lesson, and many adults haven't learned this lesson. And growing up as a teenager and even a young adult, when I should have, I didn't learn this lesson. Which I think made this episode and finale all the more powerful and personal. Powerful because it is a terrific story to tell in every sense of the word, personal for reasons I'll be getting into in just a moment. As I'm sure you've noticed in this 3-part series, I love to explore what the music in a story can offer its narrative, how it can frame a scene, and in some cases, what it can tell us about the story it's housed within. This episode does just that and reveals to us the hidden meaning of its third opening theme, and indeed the theme of Season 3 as a whole. The entire song and its chorus are all about the internal struggle of Mob and this unidentified entity he has to grapple with inside, with the resolution of this season being Mob accepting his other half and becoming
One and only one.
which makes it all the more interesting that the insert song for this season wasn't that track, but instead 99, the OP from the very first season, and the answer to why that is the case becomes clear when you look at what it represents in context. Each of the opening tracks for these 3 seasons represents something important to the material covered in that section, referring to Mob for the most part. As I mentioned, the opening for Season 3 offered a subtle hint towards necessary changes Mob needed to make, that he needs to accept that we are who we are, and that just because you don't like a part of yourself, that doesn't mean that that part isn't necessarily bad or not a part of you. That you need to make an effort not to tear yourself apart and hide away, that you need to present yourself not as a person of compartmented sections, but a person that is just as the song says, one and only one. The second opening's main message is to communicate to Mob that he needs to get ready to achieve his goals, and to remind him in no uncertain terms that he shouldn't be beholden to anyone, that he should treat himself with respect and not as someone else's doormat, to remind him, and indeed all of us, that your life is your own, no one else's. Which brings me to the insert song used in this final episode, the first opening of the entire series, otherwise known as 99. This is my personal favorite of the 3 tracks, and it's the initial and first major lesson Mob learns on his long quest for self-acceptance. So, if the goal of this arc is echoed by the words one and only one from the third OP, and this scene deals with the resolution of that mission statement for Mob accepting himself for who he is, why are we hearing 99, the Season 1 OP? Well, because this scene isn't shown from the point of view of Mob, but instead through the eyes of Reigen. And this is what makes this song choice and this scene so intensely powerful and resonant for me. I've alluded to this countless times across this review series that Reigen has, while taking advantage of Mob and those that seek his help through manipulation and deceit, he's also living a life that he isn't proud of or satisfied with. While this series has indeed been about Mob and his growth emotionally and physically, we've also been offered fleeting glimpses behind the curtain of the Reigen character himself. We've heard concerning anecdotes from his childhood about how he never joined any clubs, seen his mother's scathing emails of embarrassment towards her own son, and of course, a feeling expressed by Reigen himself that he may have felt like he missed the train to becoming the person he always wished he could be. And speaking as someone that never really felt like he had direction in life, that felt terrified to let people in growing up, and even lied to friends and family to hide who I was, Reigen, more than Mob or any other character, has emotionally connected with me. I was scared to be who I was in high school. I did what I thought was socially acceptable by going to college, but pushing in that direction just led me to being overworked, tired, exhausted, and dropping out in my 3rd year. I hated it. Following that, unable to deal with the reality, I stopped visiting my friends who were all graduating college and getting great jobs. I couldn't face them. I took up a job in a liquor store and just sort of forgot about it all. And for years, it was that way. And I've never explained this story in a video before, but I used to be really into professional wrestling. The WWE one, not the Olympic wrestling one. I thought that since I was a fan for over a decade that I knew what it took, and I figured one day it could be cool to pursue it as a career. To train super hard and travel to America to audition. And I trained. I trained hard. I trained for 2 years straight and put on a great deal of muscle in the process. I took lessons and classes in both my city and on the other side of my country that I would travel to every week on a rickety bus. All without my friends or my family knowing I put this work in. And then, right as I was about to leave for America, I had to tell my parents. And I'll never forget what my dad said to me. I'll never forget it because it was the moment I proved to myself that I wasn't who I wished I was. He said, "Son, I've never asked you not to do anything before, but please, for the love of God, don't do this." And I could hear the embarrassment in his voice when he was saying this to me. After years of telling myself that I had changed, that I had found what I wanted to do, and after making the plan and sticking to it for years, I listened to him, and I gave up. And to this day, I've never been able to watch wrestling again. This is all, of course, to say that it's easy to identify that one ought to do something in a given situation, but it takes a much stronger person to have the conviction to stick to what they sought out to accomplish in the first place. And at 23 years of age, I proved to myself that I wasn't who I thought I was. I proved to myself that I was the same shy kid who couldn't stand up for himself or be proud of who he was. That moment still, to this day, haunts me, and honestly, I don't think I'd be in the position I am now without it. Because of that decision I made, when I decided that I wanted to pursue another unconventional job in YouTube, and my dad didn't understand that either, when he came to me and had that same talk, I was able to then prove to myself that I had those convictions that I was missing before. And I was able to do that because, at that point, I knew how painful it was to take the easy way out and do as he said. Admitting to yourself you were a liar, that you were a coward, and that you lacked conviction to make your dreams a reality is a horrible existential pill to swallow. And that's what made me cry when I was watching this. And it's why this song was perfect for Reigen. A 28-year-old man having not achieved anything in school, a man who specializes in lying and scamming people, now has to take a series of terrifying steps both metaphorically and literally. Instead of letting his fear of himself take over, Reigen reveals that he's been training, that he won't let Mob win, and that he will, for Mob and for him, reach him. No matter the risks, no matter the fear, no matter what might happen, and as the hurricane of lyrics crash around him, counting his each and every step, eventually the song crescendos. And in that moment, Reigen learns the first lesson he helped to teach Mob in Season 1, that if everyone's not special, maybe he could be what he wants to be. It's the perfect song choice for a 28-year-old man running to catch up with his dreams of being the person he always wished he could have been. And while he still doesn't know if he can be that person, he's willing to take that first step and tell Mob the truth. Despite being an emotional mess with my vision obscured by a tidal wave of tears at this point, I did manage to notice that despite his best efforts, Mob still wasn't willing to listen. And that's when the single best reveal in the series happens. Interestingly, and quite fittingly, the first time Mob uses two hands against someone is against Reigen and Dimple. And I think that's a really nice touch. And what's more is, if you remember from my review of Season 2, my only criticism of the season was that it felt like the two pivotal climaxes of the series had taken place at two different points. Well, this final season remedies all of that, ending with two climaxes to the two biggest arcs of the series, delivering an emotional gut punch the likes of which left me despondent in the best of ways after viewing. I don't say this often, but this climax, this arc, this season, this story is perfect in every sense of the word. I could not in any way change something to make it better. This is a series that needs to be seen by everyone. This climax, this confession, this reconciliation is the scene and moment that Mob Psycho 100 has been building up towards. A place where two characters with effectively the exact same problem, dealing with it in totally different ways, come together to help each other. Mob lies to himself about who he is, and Reigen lies to others about who he is. Both coming from a place of self-loathing and insecurity, Mob through his powers and Reigen not seeing himself as worthy of anyone's time if he were to reveal who he was actually. And what makes this scene so special is that together they provide the other the key, the answer to what they've been looking for all along. Again, this is just a perfect scene and a perfect show.
振られた。
何？ちゃんと待ってたのかよ。
In the end, Mob doesn't get the girl. But that's not really the point. The point, nay, the triumph of this moment is that he asked her out as himself, who he truly is, and in the end allowed himself to feel all the emotions that come with that brave decision. Initially, I wasn't too warm on this Tsubomi character, but after this climax, after her waiting specifically for him despite all that was going on, I think it's clear to me at least what Mob likes about her now, and if nothing else, in those closing moments of the story, I'm glad that they are still in touch, building their relationship the right way. At the beginning of this video, I thought Season 2's climax was a fitting way to end the series on a high, and I was scared that there wouldn't be enough satisfying story in Season 3 to conclude this series in a fashion that wouldn't feel overshadowed by that climax in the prior season. In hindsight, this is honestly laughable, and for the first time in my life, I'm standing before an anime and I'm struggling to think of a way to describe it that isn't simply perfect. But I will try to condense my final thoughts and wrap up this section. Going into this series, much the same way I went into One Piece, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Hunter x Hunter, and many others like them, I was expecting to enjoy myself. And having began this series with an idea of what the author one has to offer, I was expecting a great deal of emotional resonance, with an intensely competent direction for each character involved that delivers a humorous yet emotionally fulfilling tale of good and evil. But I didn't quite understand what I was getting myself into entirely. While Mob Psycho is all of that, the flashy animation, the dramatic moments rich with emotion, and armed with a soundtrack that echoes throughout the story in equal parts awesome and ambient, there's something more to this series that honestly captured my heart in a way no other series has. It's as if while reading or watching this story, one knew something deeply personal about my life, my history, my traumas, my highs and my lows, and delivered this story to reach someone like me, with a complicated yet clear message that encourages all of us to be true to and love what makes us who we are. And that it's the desire to accept yourself and that drive to make ourselves better people that determines who we really are at the end of the day. But in truth, this story isn't about me. It's not even necessarily about Mob himself. It's a story about self-acceptance, about growth and all the mental barriers, otherworldly or otherwise, we build up internally that helps us feel a level of comfort. One that affords us the opportunity not to look at our ugly parts, the parts people have rejected us for, the parts that deeply upset us, that we try to pretend never even really existed. And so we grow up, continuing to lie to ourselves, and for some of us, we never tell ourselves that truth, that we are okay just the way we are, that we're not broken. If there's one thing that I'm taking away from this series as a whole, it's that one is a once-in-a-generation type of artist and writer. Someone that through the medium he chose managed to distill down and communicate what is in actuality a surprisingly complicated issue without making it sound trite or condescending. Growth, it's hard. Self-care is hard, and one knows that. My favorite quote from him is still from this interview when he was asked what Mob Psycho 100 was about, and he said, "What I have in mind is to tell a story of one little step. I don't believe our lives change completely for the better at a short notice. It's all the small progress we make that's important. That's what I think of while drawing this manga. A story of one little step." I don't rate things out of 10 on this channel, but Mob Psycho 100 is unequivocally and without an ounce of reservation from me, a clear and emphatic 10 out of 10 story. One that I believe needs to be seen by any young kid that's struggling to accept who they are and just needs that little bit of encouragement to find the strength within and take that one little step. I've been totally not Mark. Thanks for watching.